Coming up on this special edition of the Black Vault Radio, Mr. Nick Pope, formerly of the UKs Ministry of Defence, steps into the vault. Having worked within the UFO Program of England, he offers his insight into the UFO phenomenon, what it could be, and what he feels about the recent revelations about a secret UFO research project within the United States.
Those of us who've looked at this subject from within government are generally less certain about what we're dealing with than the UFO community are. And I tell you, when I interviewed him the following morning, his voice was still shaking, and he said, "Nick, I've never seen anything like this." They are clearly, they're getting into areas such as anti-gravity and wormholes and warp drive and deep space missions. Can we figure out any of this technology so that we, the human race, can acquire viable interstellar travel?
All that and much more. So stay tuned. The Black Vault Radio is about to begin. More than 20 years ago, I began a journey, my quest for the truth. My name is John Greenewald, and I have hammered the United States government with Freedom of Information Act requests trying to get answers. I have more than 2 million pages of declassified documents for you to download at theblackvault.com. Now, I attempt to dive even deeper and talk to some of the most brilliant minds on this planet. No government secret is off limits, and no question is off the table. All I aim for is the truth. This is the Black Vault Radio. That's right, everybody. This is the Black Vault Radio. I am your host, John Greenewald Jr. As always, thank you so much for tuning in and making this your podcast and radio show of choice, at least for the next, hour and 45 minutes or so. I know that there's a lot of options out there, so I do appreciate you tuning in. Now, this is a special edition. As you know, I dropped an episode earlier this week. Well, surprise. Here's a second one with my friend, Mr. Nick Pope. If you're not familiar with Nick, you will recognize his name from numerous television specials, documentaries. You will see him on news programs, most notably and recently Tucker Carlson on Fox News for his work being the first one to disclose the 38 reports made under the ATIP program. That is the UFO program that was revealed in late 2017. And I am excited to have Nick on. If you want to subscribe to the Black Vault Radio, I hope you listen to this and decide to do so. There are many different outlets that you can, including a raw RSS feed for all of your podcast software applications out there, to get to the show notes page, which links to all of the subscribe buttons, including the YouTube channel where you can see this on YouTube as well. You go to www.theblackvault.com/show notes. Now, this is episode number 23. Now, you just scroll down. If this is not the most recent episode, scroll down to episode 23. You'll find all of the different links, and then all over that page are the buttons on how to subscribe. The way special editions work is all of the other segments are dropped. We're going to jump right into the interview with Mr. Nick Pope in what I call the TBV Dialogues segment. That's coming right up. Stay tuned. On this episode's TBV Dialogues, I welcome Mr. Nick Pope. Nick worked for the UK's Ministry of Defence for 21 years, where his duties included researching and investigating the UFO phenomenon, and to assess whether any of those cases reported was of any defense interest. He retired back in 2006 after a final posting as an acting deputy director in the Directorate of Defence Security. Nick now works as a journalist and a broadcaster, writing for various UK national newspapers and making guest appearances on TV news shows and multiple documentaries. He also is on a long list of various UFO and alien-themed movies, TV shows, and video games where he worked as consultant and spokesperson. Nick just published his newest book, Blood Brothers. It is my pleasure to welcome my friend, Mr. Nick Pope, to the Black Vault Radio. Nick, thank you so much for joining me.
Sure, it's good to be on the show.
It's good to have you. I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I think you and I are going to have a good one about all sorts of topics. You have been gracious with your time, gave me a bit of an extension here on my interview time with you, and there is a lot of ground to cover. Now, for those who don't know you or are familiar with your background, I want you to start a little bit with your time in the UK's Ministry of Defence, and what exactly did you do for them?
Sure. Well, I had a 21-year career there, and as things progressed, I rose up the ranks somewhat. And so I did, I think 6 or 7 different jobs over the course of that 21 years, and they move you around every maybe 3-4 years, either on level transfer or on promotion, depending. And I did a wide range of different things. I've done some personnel jobs, I've done finance, I've done security. Most of what I did was assessment and briefing. I guess as a civil servant, it's all about taking a lot of detailed information, often on complex issues, and boiling it down in a brief for Secretary of State for Defense and or senior defense officials, military personnel, whoever it might be, and saying, right, this is the issue, these are the key points, this is our recommendation, etc. So, and I did as well during the first Gulf War, during the crisis in Kosovo, for example. I was one of the people seconded into the Joint Operations Center, so we would get the real-time information coming in, and again, we would have to make quick decisions, brief things up the chain of command. And so that is a fairly typical Ministry of Defense career, and I should say I was a civilian employee. Ministry of Defence is essentially the UK's equivalent of your Department of Defence, and it's both a policy-making government department and also the UK's highest level military headquarters. So that's my background, and of course the UFO job, which is what I'm best known for, was 3 years out of that 21-year career. So, you know, I've heard people say, oh yes, this was my job at the Ministry of Defence. No, it was one of a number of postings that I had in a much wider, more expansive career.
And I'm glad you point that out, because I think that is a misconception. Not that that's a bad thing or takes away from the story, but thank you for making that part clear. So a few years on, is it accurate that people call it a UFO desk? I've seen that a bit.
Yes. I've seen different versions of this. It didn't have a name. Unlike Project Blue Book or ATIP, we did not formally name our program. So it was really just the UFO policy, research, investigation, media liaison, public correspondence, all the work. And we can get into the specific outputs in a minute if you'd like.
Absolutely.
But all of that was just work embedded in a division which at the time I had the job was called Secretariat Air Staff. It later retitled to Directorate Air Staff. But talking about things like Secretariat Air Staff, SEC-AS, DAS, it's meaningless to the media and the public. So to give it a sort of does what it says on the label description, the media have tended to use UFO Project, UFO Program, UFO Desk. All of them are essentially correct. I mean, that's what we did.
Leave it to the media to sexify everything. They want everything to sound good.
Absolutely. But yes, if you wanted to be strictly correct, it would be Secretariat Air Staff. But of course, as I say, that's meaningless to people, so you have to say what it is.
Now, I do want to get into the specifics, but I also want to ask you before we do so, was this a classified program within that office? I mean, were you really operating on a level of secrecy where the general public didn't know what you were doing? Or was it like Project Blue Book, where kind of everybody in the general public knew the overall scope of Blue Book, and there weren't really high-level classifications to it? Which side was the UK's investigation on?
It was a little bit of both. We were a public-facing program. I mean, we took most of our data from the public. And you know, I got, I suppose, about 200 or 300 sighting reports each year, and most of those came from the public. So, yeah, we were absolutely a program with a public face. We had a phone line. We had, you know, our details were known. I would write letters to people, so they would have my name, my letterhead, and of course, a lot of that is now being declassified and released. So that was all in the public domain. I mean, you could not have a program to get those sightings without it being public knowledge. I mean, clearly, most of the people came to us. Some came direct, some went via the police, some went via the nearest military base or a civil airport. But you know, our existence was public knowledge, and had been for many, many years, right back to the 50s when we first set up our program. That said, of course, there was a classified side to things. I mean, we for example, worked very closely with part of the Defence Intelligence staff, the part that provided us with our scientific and technical intelligence advice, and, for example, with radar experts as well, a different bunch of specialists. And all of that was something that was obviously internal only. Mm-hmm. We discussed this in face-to-face meetings, in correspondence. A lot of that was classified. And again, some of that information is now being declassified and released so people can see. So that's why I say there were two sides to this, the public side and the internal side, where we sat down amongst ourselves and asked ourselves the $64,000 question: what are we dealing with here?
And were military cases involved as well, or was this just reports from the general public? All of the above. Everything, I mean, all of the above.
Yeah,
okay.
Everything went into the pot. Now we had debates about this, which sometimes got quite heated. For example, there was a faction at the MOD that wanted to cut out the public altogether, and ultimately that faction won out. And the feeling was slightly patronizing, and I totally disagreed with it. You know, the view was, oh, well, we should have a UFO program, but we should focus it on military reports, police officers, pilots, radar operators, and that's it. I thought that was superficially attractive, but it's always bad science to avoid to ignore data. And there was one colleague of mine in intelligence who absolutely agreed and said, you just don't know until you sit down and start looking at things and analyzing the data, what's going to be important and what isn't.
Now, I think you said the 1950s. What did this start in the UK in literally the 1950s, and they've been investigating, or did I misunderstand that?
No, it was 1953 that we got our formal UFO program, but there had been ad hoc activities before that. Okay. I think you could say that the roots of this went back to the Second World War, where certainly the Royal Air Force had many reports of so-called Foo Fighters. And again, some files from Bomber Command have now been released showing that on various missions, Royal Air Force aircraft on bombing raids over occupied Europe and Germany encountered these strange balls of light, but in other cases more than that. I mean, structured craft, apparently metallic, speeds and maneuvers that we couldn't match. And of course, the thinking at the time was, my goodness, this is some sort of Axis secret weapon, only it didn't turn out to be that. So it was maybe something else. So we had those reports in the Second World War. Then in 1950, we set up something called the Flying Saucer Working Party, which reported in 51 and was our first formal look at the phenomenon. And the UK got alongside the US with that and tapped into whatever was going on with Project Sign, for example. And then the recommendation of the Flying Saucer Working Party in 1951 was that this is probably all just misidentification, hoax, or delusion. And then the very next year, 1952, was the big main brace NATO exercise where there were multiple UFO sightings, radar visual sightings, lots of reports from pilots, etc. And so at that point, the Ministry of Defence reconsidered, and the next year, 53, we got a formal program, the brief of which was to research and investigate the UFO phenomenon to determine whether there was anything of any defence significance.
And was there? Did you guys find that there was?
Well, it depends who you ask, and it also depends how you define defence significance.
Sure.
And in true civil service style, in one sense, we never really did define it. So it left the door open for us to put whatever spin on it that we wanted. Now, in terms of was there a threat? I mean, government always looks at everything. Not just UFOs, but everything, through the lens of threats and opportunities. So it doesn't matter whether you're talking about UFOs or a new pensions policy. Somebody will sit down and basically, what are the threats, what are the opportunities, and what can go wrong, what can go right, in other words. With UFOs, the threat was, well, is there going to be some sort of overt hostility, whatever we're dealing with? Whether it's Russians or Martians, in one sense it didn't matter. Something unidentified in our airspace, we need to know what it is, who's flying it, what are its intentions and capabilities, which is another phrase that we use a lot. I don't know whether some of these phrases are used also in the US, but certainly in the UK we talk about threats and opportunities, we talk about capabilities and intentions, those sorts of things. So that's how we approached it. In terms of did we find anything of defense significance, we did not find evidence of an overt threat. However, in one sense, we couldn't rule that out. And without wanting to get too technical, you can define a threat as being a product of capability and intent. We had some data on capabilities in terms of speeds, maneuvers, reported, etc. We had no idea of intent because we didn't know what we were dealing with.
Now, your tenure there ended in 2006. At that point, did the investigations continue, I assume, or did they end at some point?
Well, my time on the UFO project was 91 to 94.
Oh, okay.
So after I was promoted out of that post after 3 years, I did a finance job, then I was promoted out of that, and I did a security job. So I took early retirement from the Ministry of Defence in 2006. The UFO program was still continuing, but in 2009, it was terminated as part of a wider series of defense cuts. And at the time, the public statement was, well, we've been looking at this for over 50 years, and we haven't found evidence of a threat. I think that's slightly disingenuous. I think a more accurate assessment would have been, we haven't figured out what we're dealing with. We still haven't figured it out. Well, do you throw good money after bad and keep on at it, or not? And they decided not to. Or did they? I mean, I've heard consistent reports that UFOs are still being looked at, but probably in the margins of something else. And again, we can get into a discussion about ATIP and how you hide a UFO program by embedding the work in something else and calling it something different. I know, for example, that clearly if a military pilot is on a sortie, sees a UFO, simultaneously tracked on radar, reports it up the chain of command afterwards, no one's going to say, we'll ignore that. Someone's going to look at that. It's just, I think it now goes on outside of a formally constituted program, and it goes on in the margins of, as I say, something else. A few years ago, for example, it was embedded, I believe, in air safety work. So these things were reported as near misses, and people were using euphemistic terms to kind of hide what this really was by talking about unconventional helicopters, unusual aircraft, and it was just code phrase really for UFO.
Yeah, without saying the acronym UFO. We'll definitely be getting into ATIP. I just wanted to kind of pick your brain about your time there and see how you felt about the program before you were assigned it and then after. Did you have thoughts on UFOs and what they were before you were assigned to this desk, or did you not even think about it?
No, not really. It wasn't something that had particularly crossed my mind, but when I joined the Ministry of Defence, like everyone, young and ambitious, looking through the phone directory, which was itself a classified document, about 2 or 3 inches thick, and reading all the job descriptions and trying to plan what we wanted to do. Most people wanted to work, as did I, in like the outer office of the Secretary of State for Defense, for example, because those were the real high flyer jobs. But somewhere in that phone book there was just one job that just had the word UFOs next to it, and everyone kind of looked and wondered. And little did I think that one day that job would be mine. But I didn't have any particular knowledge of the subject, any particular beliefs either way, so I just went in thinking, okay, I will do this job, and at first I think I obviously encountered a whole bunch of fairly routine cases that turned out to be aircraft lights, weather balloons, meteors, satellites, etc., etc. But as time went on, some more interesting ones crossed my desk, and of course so that I could get the background knowledge, I read back into the extensive archives of this. And when I say extensive, and we can get onto the release program later if you like, but to date, the British government has declassified and released about 60,000 pages of documents on UFOs. So this wasn't a small undertaking. There was a lot going on over the years.
Yeah, it sounds like a big operation. Now, what to you personally stuck out during your time there? And I'll ask you the same question about the information that's come out, because obviously there's a lot more information than when you were involved in the program. But let's start with when you were there. What sticks out to you as being a wow case, that's something that we shouldn't ignore?
Well, I had a wave of sightings in 1993, sometimes generically referred to as the Cosford incident. And this was a series of sightings that took place over a period of about 6 hours in late at night on March 30th and in the early hours of March 31st, 1993. And we had in all, I guess, maybe 100 witnesses who we were able to identify over many different parts of the country, including a lot of police officers and military personnel, and particularly 2 Air Force bases, RAF Cosford and RAF Shawbury, were locations where there were fairly close encounters. And I remember the meteorological officer at Shawbury telling me about this huge triangular-shaped craft flying low and slow over the base at a height of maybe 200 feet, possibly less, emitting a low-frequency humming sound. He said this thing was midway in size between a C-130 transport aircraft and a Boeing 747, moving really slow. He said like 30, 40 miles an hour. He said he couldn't understand how it was staying up there, and the vast shape, the power of this thing. And then suddenly, he said, it just accelerated away to the horizon many times faster than a jet aircraft, a military jet aircraft. And this was a guy with 8 years experience in the Air Force. And I tell you, when I interviewed him the following morning, I mean, his voice was still shaking. And he said, "Nick, I've never seen anything like this." And there's a fairly extensive file on that incident, which has now been declassified. We turned up, interestingly, a re-entry of a Russian rocket, which explained a cluster of sightings at about 1:10 in the morning. But it's these other activities. One of the civilian witnesses described this thing as being like two Concorde aircraft pasted together. There was another surreal incident where someone thought the thing was so low that it had landed in a field, and he went into the field only to find a whole bunch of cows just in a perfect circle facing each other. Sounds like something out of the X-Files. But,
yeah, really.
You know, a case like that, and I briefed it up the chain of command. I know it went to the Assistant Chief of the Air Staff, and we through the embassies spoke to the U.S. about this, and we were trying to ask, obviously, do you have some sort of secret prototype hypersonic aircraft that might explain this? And the U.S. apparently said no, but actually, funny you should ask. We've had some similar sightings. We wondered if you Brits had anything like that, and of course we said no, but we wish we did.
Wow. Now, just out of curiosity, obviously you said that the conclusion to these programs were the fact that they weren't of defense interest or not a threat. How is something like that, where it's obviously over a military base, exhibiting technology that wasn't American and obviously wasn't British, how is that not a threat? You know, I mean, like, how did those cases, and I'm sure that's not the only one, how did those kind of stand forgotten when they drew these conclusions?
Well, I'm not sure they did stand forgotten. I think I want to dispel any view that we all spoke with one voice on this. No, we absolutely didn't. Internally, we had very vigorous debates about what we were dealing with and whether there were threats and how we should handle it. And actually, those divisions were apparent, certainly when I was doing that job in the 90s, but I subsequently found out that the situation became so acrimonious after I left. I don't know exactly why, but I enjoyed a very good working relationship with colleagues in the Defense Intelligence Staff. My successors, for whatever reason, did not. It might have been security clearance issue, I don't know. But for whatever reason, they didn't. And I've seen some recently declassified papers which show that essentially the two sides had completely different views on what we were dealing with, and my successors were saying, yeah, there's nothing to this. And the Defense Intelligence Staff in internal letters and documents to each other were saying, well, we went over to see them, and they said that these sightings were not significant. How would they know? They don't know anything about how to do an intelligence assessment, for example. They don't know, and they've started deciding only to take seriously reports from pilots and radar operators. How do they know, what is going to prove to be significant and what isn't? Often it's intelligence work is about joining the dots, and to cut out the public like that, you might be missing a piece of the puzzle. So there was never one single view on this. There was always a faction that thought this was real, whatever it was, and therefore there were threats and there were opportunities. And one document even says, in relation to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, we can't rule it out, and clearly if this turns out to be true, it goes on, and the quote is, we could use this technology if it exists. So that's where the intelligence people are talking about the potential opportunities from a proper understanding of the UFO phenomenon.
And it sounds really familiar to some of the revelations here in America, potentially about ATIP, which we're definitely going to get into. Let me ask you away from the official line now. So just asking Nick Pope, not a ex-Ministry of Defense. What did you walk away with after seeing what you did? And you can combine that with what you've seen now declassified, which potentially came after you had left the UFO desk, so to speak. What are you convinced of, if anything?
Well, I'm still not one of these. There's a kind of, I think it's one of my three laws, if I have three laws, that those of us who've looked at this subject from within government are generally less certain about what we're dealing with than the UFO community are, who seem to polarize in terms of it's all either just complete nonsense or it's definitely aliens. Mm-hmm. And actually, I take a more nuanced view, and I'm also one of these people who's not afraid to say, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I can tell you what it isn't. It isn't all just misidentifications, hoaxes, and delusions. There's something over and above that. But what it is, I don't have any smoking gun piece of evidence that is convincing enough for me to come down on one side or the other and say, yes, it's extraterrestrial, or mm-hmm. it's interdimensional, or it's some sort of exotic atmospheric plasma phenomenon, or whatever the theory of the day happens to be. So my bottom line is, I don't know, but there is something tangible and worthy of proper scientific and military study.
So enough evidence to keep asking that extraterrestrial question, though.
Yes, and as long as there is a non-zero probability of this falls into the category of what I would describe as a typical low probability, high impact scenario. Even if you are thinking this is a very, very long shot, mm-hmm. the potential payoff, if just one of these cases, just one, turns out to be the real thing, is so vast that we must be in the game. I mean, we simply must be. So that's my take.
Yeah, and I'm going to start shifting towards America too, because obviously you've made quite a few headlines here in the last couple of weeks. So I'm definitely getting there. But I wanted to kind of create a little bit of a groundwork of your background, but also where you came from and your mindset as we shift to America. And as I do that, I want to ask you, are world governments now on a global scale, do you feel with everything that you have seen that they are missing the boat by not taking this more seriously? Or do you think that they're taking it very, very seriously, but they're trying to hide their interest?
I think it's a mixed bag. I have no doubt that the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, and others are looking at this. Mm-hmm. I mean, they would be crazy not to, if only for the low probability, high impact point that I mentioned. So other governments look at it. Some don't. Some have probably genuinely closed their programs or never had programs in the first instance. I want to say one other point, and I think it's an important point in all this. The French government is interesting to me because one of the things that always strikes me about UFO work in government is that most governments that have had UFO programs have embedded that work in their Air Force, in their Department of Defense, but essentially it's been a military program. The French, they put it in their CNES, the French National Space Agency, and that gives them a different model. I'm not saying necessarily better, but it's interesting in having the debate about where in government should a UFO program actually sit. It is an interesting and often not discussed point that you don't have to put it in the DoD or the Air Force.
No, but generally that's going to be where it is because there, in my opinion anyway, there is such a defensive interest in this. And going back to what you say, the opportunity to build something, alien or not, Russian or not, Iranian or not, Chinese or not, it like the Defense Department, at least here in America, and I'm sure probably the same in the UK, their interest is always, how can we use it as a weapon? And one prime example of that is the Apollo mission here in America when we were in the space race with the Soviet Union. I love this document. It's one of my favorite ones that I've seen, and it was Project Horizon. And we all knew that Project Apollo we were going to go to the moon and hoorah, good, go USA, and we're going to beat the Soviets and go. But behind the scenes, the Department of Defense actually built the model for a Department of Defense structure on the surface of the moon. So they will put anything and spin it to the military, space programs and everything. So I'm not sure if outside the Defense Department would be a great way. Now, NASA here had investigated UFOs. They funded SETI for a while. In the UK, were there any equivalent type programs that other than the one that you worked on, but outside of that Ministry of Defense, were there any other programs there?
No, not really. I mean, from time to time, I think some scientists thought about the issue, but it was never an official program. I mean, you're absolutely right in one respect. I mean, wherever you have a UFO program, it is going to need military assets to do its job, simply because military radar systems and things like the ballistic missile early warning system, for example, are the tools that you need. The space tracking radars, those are the tools that you need to investigate. It's just a question of whether there shouldn't be a more scientific input into this, because otherwise, as you say, the mindset is simply, well, can we build a weapon out of any of this?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's the only mindset, but if you look, for example, at the declassified British intelligence assessment, which is colloquially known as Project Condign, you will see lines that talk about the potential technological spin-offs from a better understanding of the phenomenon, whatever it turns out to be. And it talks about very high-frequency energy generation, and directed energy weapons get in there, RF weapons. So that was one of the things that we were thinking about.
And some of the revelations here in America, and you spearheaded really bringing this to the forefront and mainstream media, and that is the disclosure of what the ATIP program, or the media called here the secret Pentagon UFO study, and we're going to get into all of that here through the remainder of the show. But you spearheaded really putting the spotlight on some documents that came from the DIA on reports that were generated that got into some of that advanced technology that somehow was connected to ATIP. Now, before I want you to break down that document, for those listening, because the Black Vault Radio gets a lot of different people, not necessarily just UFO followers, let everybody know just kind of a brief overview of what ATIP actually is and what has been reported about it thus far.
Well, of course, this really exploded into the public consciousness just over a year ago when the New York Times, mainly, but closely followed by Washington Post and Politico, published articles essentially saying that despite years of denial that there was any U.S. interest in UFOs, there was indeed a program that had looked at this, and it was called, though there is quite a bit of debate, as you well know, about the name, but essentially Advanced Aerospace Threat and Identification Program, or ATIP. There are debates about whether it's aerospace or aviation. There are debates about whether there's an extra "and" in there somewhere. And at one stage, the thing was apparently called ORSAP, Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Application Program. But essentially the debate was, well, was this or was this not a UFO program? Harry Reid, former Senate Majority Leader, who was instrumental really in getting this funded and set up, said absolutely it was. He talked about his discussions with the astronaut John Glenn as being instrumental in convincing him that something should be done to look at this phenomenon more seriously and closely. Luis Elizondo, of course, who was involved with and latterly ran the program out of the Defense Intelligence Agency, has said, yes, this was a UFO program. But obviously there were doubts about this, and skeptics, I think their position was, I'm not entirely familiar with the ins and outs of the different skeptical arguments. I think some people were saying the whole thing was made up. Well, clearly it wasn't. Others were saying, well, maybe it's been missold to us and misrepresented, misdescribed as a UFO program. Maybe it was what the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Department of Defense said it was when they grudgingly acknowledged its existence. In other words, the line from DoD and DIA, generally speaking, was, yeah, this was an advanced aerospace program. And that debate continues, I think, but what turned up in the last three weeks or so is interesting. Way back last year, a Swedish researcher called Roger Glassel, I think it was, spotted in the congressional record a reference to the DIA sending the House Armed Services Committee a brief on ATIP. And Roger and a number of other researchers, probably you're in the list as well. I think you made a Freedom of Information Act request, of course. Keith Basterfield, Paul Dean. I know there are others. Stephen Aftergood from Federation of American Scientists. All made Freedom of Information Act requests. And in parallel, because I now work as a journalist, one of the things that I did was that I reached out to the DIA's Office of Corporate Communications. And so I never made an FOI request. I was speaking basically to a public affairs officer, press officer at DIA. And then on January 16th, in the morning, I got an email to say, here is this DIA letter to Congress that you've been asking for. And I figured there were probably other people who were going to be receiving this too. I was sure I was not the only journalist who'd asked for this. I knew that a whole bunch of researchers had probably put in Freedom of Information Act requests. So I thought, you know what, I'm just going to publish it. And so I tweeted it, the joys of social media and 24/7. So I converted the PDF to JPEGs, and I just tweeted them. And I said, we now have this letter. And it's interesting. I mean, you've seen it, you've received it, but for the listeners, it's a fascinating document. It's 5 pages, and the cover letter is interesting because I mentioned DoD and DIA have pretty much always tried to spin this as being this is just an aerospace program, and it's all about aviation. And sure enough, in the cover letter to John McCain and to Jack Reed, they say the purpose of ATIP was to investigate foreign advanced aerospace weapons threats from the present out to the next 40 years. And that sounds pretty much in line with most of their previous statements on this. And then you look at the actual list of defense intelligence reference documents that is attached to the letter. And those 38 programs tell a very different story. And they are clearly, they're getting into areas such as anti-gravity and wormholes and warp drive and deep space missions. And the clincher is that there's a paper on the Drake equation there. And of course, as you know, the Drake equation, formulated by Frank Drake, the astronomer, the radio astronomer, as a means of trying to estimate how many communicable civilizations there might be in our galaxy, the Milky Way, but by extrapolation in the wider universe. Well, clearly, if this was an aviation program, why would one of your outputs be looking at the Drake equation, and why would you be looking at clearly deep space travel stuff. And flipping the argument the other way around, if this was really what DIA had told Congress it was, looking at foreign advanced aerospace weapon threats, for the next 40 years, where are the papers on Russian aerodynamics research? Where are the papers on Chinese production capacity? Where are the papers on Iranian and North Korean drone and ballistic missile aspirations? There aren't any. I know enough about intelligence programs to know that if you're really studying aviation threats, you'd be looking at Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. You'd be looking at aircraft, missiles, drones.
Yeah.
There's none of that.
Well,
none of that in the list of attachments.
Yeah, and I want to jump in here just because you brought up the point, and it's a good one. There's also no papers about UFOs.
No, exactly.
And that to me struck me, and I want to talk about the content of the other reports, but I want your thoughts on this. If ATIP was a UFO program, which, look, if it is, great. I'm asking the question. I'm not convinced. I know we have the testimony of Mr. Luis Elizondo, and we'll get into some of the things that he has claimed in a bit. But we have that. Senator Harry Reid, okay, look, I'm not really sure what to think of his statements, but they are far from official. So we can't, even though he was a former senator and even though he advocated for the funding, at this point, we can't say what he is saying is gospel. I'm sorry, we just can't. And that's not directed at you, Nick, just in the overall scope of the conversation. That Harry Reid statement, I'm not sure if that really drives home the whole ATIP thing. So here's what I would throw out before we get into the specifics of the 38 papers. In the same respect that there's nothing about aircraft, there's also nothing about UFOs. Do you have a thought on why there wouldn't be?
Yes, because I think they came at it from a different approach, and I'll get into that in a minute. Now we can discuss. I just want to take a step back and say, I understand your point about Harry Reid and Luis Elizondo, but in trying to assess what ATIP is, I think really two of the most important voices in that assessment must be, the guy who pretty much set up the program, Harry Reid, and the guy who ran it, Lou Elizondo. And I'm not saying that they're the only voices, but when outsiders, and I'm an outsider on this, I had no official knowledge or involvement of the ATIP program, but when outsiders are looking at ATIP and trying to assess what it is, I think we do have to listen and give a hefty weight to the words of Harry Reid and Luis Elizondo. And no, it's not necessarily the official word on that, but Harry Reid pretty much set up the program. I mean, it really his brainchild. And if he says this is what it was, then I think that carries a lot of weight and authority.
Well, that's a fair point. Here's what I would say, though, using only a rebuttal by the words of Harry Reid. Now, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but I can be challenged on this. That's fine. Harry Reid did say, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he stayed out of the program once it got funded. So when you then trace back the lineage of ATIP, and this is where I disagree with the Pentagon, but I could be wrong as well. The Pentagon said that ATIP and OSAP were the same thing. That was given by a spokesperson of the Pentagon, Major Audricia Harris. She said that, I believe, to Roger Glazel as well. She never said that to me. That was the only time I think that she had said that they were the same thing because Roger had asked. Now, why do I bring this up? Because then when you backtrack and look at the original, what they call solicitation for bids, which is how Bigelow Aerospace got involved, when you look at what the description of OSAP really was, there's like nothing connected to UFOs. Now, take that, Bigelow Aerospace got the contract, and Harry Reid himself said he stayed out of it. So I don't, are you 100% confident, and this is a genuine question, I'm not challenging, that he really did lay the blueprints to what ATIP was? Or do you think that he got the funding? It went to Bigelow Aerospace primarily. That's questionable, but what we're told anyway, it primarily went to Bigelow Aerospace, and they then took the rest.
No, I think Harry Reid knew exactly what he was looking into, and as you know better than most, we have, in one sense, a staggeringly little amount of actual verifiable documentation on this. I think one of the things we do have, which is an important piece of the puzzle, is Harry Reid's June 24th, 2009 letter to William Lynn III at the DoD. And I think the language in there, again, is I think, pretty suggestive of what we're really dealing with. Look, I think one reason that they were very careful about not mentioning UFOs, well, two reasons. Firstly, it makes it more difficult for people using the Freedom of Information Act, obviously.
Okay.
Secondly, as Lou Elizondo and others have said, there was Pentagon pushback from the faction that thought that UFOs were demonic and that therefore we shouldn't be getting into it. So you had some people wanting to do serious scientific research and investigation of the phenomenon. And you had other people who said, no, we believe that UFOs are demonic, therefore we shouldn't be, as it were, feeding that. And this is a whole other debate, but I think it goes back to, and I came across similar things from time to time in the UK. There's a passage in, I think it's the book of Ephesians in the Bible, where it says words to the effect of, it describes Satan, and it uses the phrase, the prince of the power of the air. And that seems to be the quote that, dating back to the 50s, had convinced some people in government that this was demonic and that we shouldn't be dealing with it. So there were a number of very good reasons why everyone from Harry Reid downwards bent over backwards not to use the phrase UFO in any of this. And that's quite before you get into all the pop culture baggage that the term has. I mentioned a while ago that we used eventually terms like unusual helicopter and unconventional aircraft.
Yeah.
Before that, we changed the terminology to UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, and we did that partly to kind of make it a little bit more FOI-proof, though that ultimately didn't work, but mainly for the internal debates. Look, we wanted funding to do this properly, and we knew that because of the pop culture baggage, if we went and said we want to look at UFOs, we wouldn't have got it. But if we went up and said, as we did, we want to look at unidentified aerial phenomena, when pilots and radar operators encounter things, it was just a slightly different take on the same thing, but enough to get it through.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I wanted to... No, you go first, because I think we're getting to some interesting stuff.
Yeah,
here.
no, absolutely. And the reason why I wanted you to lay the groundwork in the beginning with your work on the UK project is obviously you are the man to go to speak to that. And I had asked you about classification, and you gave us the information. What I do in approaching this topic, and look, I'm the first to say I'm not very popular with a small circle of people who support To the Stars Academy and the ATIP is a UFO program and there's no questioning it. I'm not popular by asking these questions, but here's what I want to ask you based on your background and what you've laid out with your work on the UK UFO project and the confirmed UFO project we know about here in the States, which is Project Blue Book. When I look and approach, is ATIP a UFO project? I take your expertise, because I'm not when it comes to the UK UFO material. I take the Project Blue Book, which I know you're very well aware of as well, and compare ATIP to that. Your project and the American project, Blue Book, all pretty much unclassified, pretty much in the public eye. They never denied it. They were taking public reports and so on. That is something that's undeniable, documented, and verifiable. With ATIP, all of a sudden now you have this gigantic shroud of secrecy to not have the UFO term in there. And that's what confuses me, is because I would think that it would be less of a conspiracy if the U.S. government just came out and said, yeah, we're looking into UFOs. We don't think they're alien, but we're worried that they're Russian. We're worried that they're Chinese. We're worried that they're Iranian, and we need to look at it. So my question, and I struggle with this, I don't know what the right answer is, but why would ATIP be so different? And the government is going on the record, documenting in writing that this is not a UFO program. The Pentagon did it through their official spokesperson, and the DIA did it, I believe, with Wired magazine. I had never talked to the DIA Public Affairs Office for an official word. I'm trying to get one. I've been trying to get one. I actually tried again for this show to kind of clarify some points, and I have yet to get any written response. But I know that they did it with Wired magazine. The whole reason I say that is you have confirmed UFO programs from the UK and from the United States. And to me, nothing matches up with what Mr. Elizondo has said and what has come out officially, even with these documents. And I do want to get into what the 38 are, on why I feel that way. But do you have any thoughts on why all of a sudden a UFO program would have such blatant lies attached to it when all the other examples we have since the dawn of those programs we have not?
Well, I think one of the factors is that both Blue Book and the UK's program were largely public-facing programs, and therefore the existence of them was never denied. The problem that the US perhaps faced was that for years they said, and I don't know whether these statements have now been quietly removed from the website, but for years, if you went to the website of DoD or USAF or NASA or you went to any of the public affairs offices and asked, you would get the line, "We do not look," no one in the US government is looking at UFOs, and hasn't since Blue Book was terminated in '69. So I think in one sense it was the kind of, gosh, we've been misleading people for decades with the public statements on that, and of course all the people writing those lines, all the press officers who have the standard briefing packs, the Q&As that say, oh, anytime anyone asks about UFOs, give them this line. They clearly weren't briefed in on what was a very cleverly, in one sense, hidden intelligence program. So that's one part of it. But I want to two things: the answer to your main question of why is it so different, and the answer to your question, which I haven't forgotten, about fair point. There are no papers about Russian and Chinese aircraft in there, but there aren't any papers about UFOs either. And I want to come on to that in a minute. But I should just one more piece of the puzzle, and it's Roger Glassell again. He did get, as I recall, a statement from Major Harris that followed the usual DIA line and said this is far-term advanced aerospace threats, but did then critically add the rider, including anomalous events, reported by U.S. Navy pilots or other credible sources. So Roger Glassell got that little statement, which just went a little bit further. And it's interesting that was not in the cover letter that DIA sent to Congress, and perhaps it should have been. So that statement by Major Harris was slightly different, maybe to what Wired magazine and you got told. So again, there are still some questions to be answered on this. But why, okay, let me address the question, why no UFO papers in the list of attachments, the 38 DIRDs? I think it's because they took a fundamentally different approach. And I think that they learnt, I'm sure, from some of the mistakes that we made in the UK, And it will have been possibly in their minds that certainly from 2009 onwards, the UK actually terminated its program. So something like ATIP always had a precarious existence. Funding is always an issue. There was the religious pushback issue that I mentioned. These people, in some senses, had to stay off the radar and bend over backwards not to use the phrase UFO. I think the approach they used was, instead of saying, what are UFOs? Let's investigate each case as it comes in and see what we can find out. I think they took a conceptual leap and they said, well, look, we've tried that approach before. I mean, in one sense, that was what Blue Book did. It's what the British government did, the French. And you could say that's 50 years of failure to answer the question. So I think ATIP took a different approach, and clearly with those 38 studies, it's almost as if, I was thinking about this yesterday, how to describe this. It's almost as if somebody had asked the question and said, let's break away from this just case-by-case investigation. It's almost as if someone had asked the question, if any of this is extraterrestrial, how do they get here from there? Mm-hmm. What technologies are they using? Does any of that stand up scientifically? And can any of this give us a handle on this? And I think if you approach it from that point of view and answer the question, if any of this is real, what technologies would we be using? Can we understand them? Do they violate the laws of physics and thus can we throw them out? Or are there workarounds? Are there scientific theories which mean this might be possible and thus would give us a handle on what we're dealing with? And when I look at those list of 38 defense intelligence reference documents, it seems to me that that's the question they were answering.
Let me say something that probably won't be popular, and I'm interested in your thoughts about it, because what you just said makes perfect sense. But I think, to play devil's advocate, that list of 38 reports could actually be quite the opposite and support the government's point of view and claim about what ATIP was. Now, let me say why very quickly. What I've done, and I'll omit the Drake equation paper temporarily, because I want to address that as well. But according to the government, that this was something to look at aerial technology through the next 40 years. You know, what could we look at? And when you look at the 38 papers, invisibility cloaking, warp drives, anti-gravity, all really cool stuff. And on the surface, that's amazing. But there's a government agency out there called the Defense Technical Information Center, or DTIC. For years, I've filed FOIA requests to them. I've received tens of thousands of pages and leads and what I call FOIA fodder. You know, I mean, they just give you amazing material. They have literally hundreds, if not thousands, of papers on anti-gravity, warp drives, invisibility cloaking, everything that's in these 38 lists. Now, why do they have them? Well, the defense community uses DTIC for reference purposes. They can go in there and get these records. I would argue that as much as this may support a UFO program, on the contrary, it actually more so supports the research that the government has been doing for decades, even prior to ATIP, which includes warp drives. And you can search NASA's science database. They have a lot of reports there on warp drives. I compiled a list on because the most newsworthy, and you may disagree with this, but in my opinion, like the news headlines that went around once this list was complete, was the invisibility cloaking, because that's pretty amazing. Like that's an amazing technology. So what I did was I went through my archive and also hit DTIC and compiled a list of documents pertaining to metamaterials and invisibility cloaking. And there were multiple military agencies that have been in this research for years and years, pre-ATIP, during ATIP, and post-ATIP. So I just am curious to your thoughts that, yes, it could support a UFO program, but in the same respect, all of those papers have been aerodynamic research angles, aerospace research angles of the military for many years. And that's why I fall back, like, why I wish that at least one paper could have been on UFOs. So when you do kind of combine the 38 reports, which on the surface are fascinating, you have to combine that with the fact that there are actually hundreds, if not thousands of other papers on the exact same topics.
Oh, sure. I mean, I can absolutely. We can go down the list and we can say that clearly a number of those papers would indeed fit with aircraft. I mean, sure, if you can make an aircraft invisible, that's a great military advantage. So something like the paper on invisibility cloaking, which you mentioned, absolutely, you could say you would expect to find that in a far-term aviation project, and you know, some of the propulsion kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. I mean, again, you know, the faster that you can go with aircraft and missiles and drones, the better. I think that theory begins to you know, break down a little bit when we get into, you know, advanced nuclear propulsion for manned deep space missions and stargates and wormholes. That, as I said earlier, is where, to me, it begins to sound like something less configured on aircraft, missiles, and drones, and more configured on, you know, taking humankind out into the wider cosmos, or figuring out how somebody else does that in reverse. And there's one other aspect, and there's the Drake equation,
yes,
one that we. But there's another aspect to this, and this hasn't quite been gone into, I think, and that's the paper by Kit Green on the biological effects of all this. And that ties in with the idea that part of this program was looking at the claims of people who had maybe had a close encounter. And for years, of course, there have been many reports of electromagnetic interference as a result of UFO encounters, everything from car radios and engines kind of cutting out to people feeling sick. And again, that to me suggests somebody is, as I say, asking questions about UFOs, but in a different way, getting away from the kind of, what is this sighting? Yeah. What, you know, Mr. Smith was out walking his dog and saw something at 10 at night. What was it? It's getting away from that. It's getting into if this is real, what are we dealing with? Yeah. What are the technologies? What are the effects of those technologies when they interact with people? And can we figure out any of this technology so that we, the human race, can acquire viable interstellar travel? Yeah. Without which, you know, at some point in the future, the human race will go extinct unless we acquire viable interstellar travel. Yeah, we need to get off the planet, and that's a fascinating discussion by itself. Yeah, it's an existential threat. I mean, the kind of time limit imposed by our own sun is an existential. It's not a threat; it's a certainty. At some point, life on Earth will cease to be possible, and that will obviously be long before our sun actually becomes a red giant. Yeah. But, and like I said, that's a fascinating show in itself. I love that topic. I do want to go back to the Drake equation, because that to me was the most intriguing report in there. And I have, again, wrestled with why would it be in there. Now, context is key when looking at these documents. And that is, we are trying to, you and I even are debating, hey, what do these reports actually mean? Now, working backwards, and I'm sure you've read the transcript, or maybe you were even there, I'm not sure, but I know that Dr. Hal Puthoff gave a presentation in Las Vegas to a conference, I want to say last year, and mentioned these 38 reports. Now that the
38 reports have been revealed, and the titles obviously leaked out. George Knapp had reported it last year. The titles have been floated around, one of which was redacted. Obviously, now we have
George. I was remiss in not crediting George Knapp for this, of course, but as you know, the important thing about what happened 3 weeks ago was that this ceased to be leaked information and became officially released by the DIA information. So George was right. George was absolutely right, and his list was right. But what we now have is clearly this list and the cover letter from the DIA to Congress.
Yeah.
But important to check George's contribution.
Yeah, and what's interesting, we talk about this later, because I do want to make this point about context, but there were slight variations between George's list that had been published and then this one. Very, very similar, but there were differences, and I'm actually curious what the difference would be, because obviously George does have something official. I'm not debating whether or not it was a real document, but there were kind of differences there. But again, we could talk about that later. What I'm more interested in is then the context of what these 38 are. Now, the assumption was that the Pentagon / either Mr. Luis Elizondo himself or whomever held the position prior, depends on the dates that these were written and so on. But when Dr. Hal Puthoff gave his speech, he said he was the one that called the shots for these 38. He called them contracts. So he gave out 38 contracts over a 2-year period. Now, I can assume, because some of the reports are dated 2010 and 2008, that is actually the range of the 2 years, but that can be debated. I don't like reading quotes on the air, but I think in this case it's definitely worthwhile. Now, Nick, have you seen or heard that speech that he gave?
Yes, I was not actually in the audience at that event, but I did see, I believe, the transcript afterwards. But no, please do quote the relevant.
Yeah, I'm not going to read the whole thing. This is just the part about what we're talking about, so I figured the audience would want to hear this. This is what Dr. Hal Puthoff said. Now, obviously, I am reading a transcript, so I will not do his, punching of words and et cetera justice, but I will do my best. Here's the quote. So, I let out 38 contracts over a 2-year period. I'll show you what the studies were on. You can read them there. Positron aerospace propulsion, IEC fusion as a compact energy source, warp drive, dark energy, extra dimensions, metallic glasses for aerospace use. Really cutting edge kind of things. Here are some more of the papers that I commissioned. Negative mass propulsion, anti-gravity for aerospace applications, programmable matter, invisibility cloaking. These are just the kind of things that we needed to have maximum technical input from the best people around the globe. And so that's what we did. That's what I did. Now we could wait. We told these people they could publish their reports in physics journals and engineering journals. But of course, the contractors didn't want to wait for that. So the DIA bundled up these 38 papers and put them out as defense intelligence reference documents, posted on a JWICS server that anyone in the government or contractors could get access to. By and large, they have not been released to the public yet. A couple of them leaked out. Obviously, a couple more and that is the end of the quote. Obviously, a couple more have leaked out. So now, the reason why I wanted to read that quote is now we know that it was a contractor decision to put these papers in. So the question mark is why? And that's where I say context is key. And when we talk about the Drake equation, again, let me just kind of throw this out. I'm not saying that this is necessarily what I believe, but for conversation's sake, if we do achieve the warp drive, which was a subject of some of those papers, we have to then go towards the deep space travel route, which is a defensive concern. Again, I go back to those documents that I mentioned earlier in the interview with Project Horizon, where we were just going to the moon. And what did the Defense Department want to do? Put a base on the moon. That's all documented. That's all real and historical fact. So in the same respect, at the moment that aerospace and aviation can achieve, interstellar travel, even if it's just to the moon or beyond, we've proven that we want to put defensive structures wherever we go. And so I think that quite possibly, number one, this was a defense contractor decision to put these papers in. So we don't know if the Pentagon even wanted it, the DIA wanted it, if they instructed it. They may have. I'm just saying that we don't know that yet. We know that by Dr. Hal Puthoff's own words, it was his call, that he did it on behalf of Bigelow Aerospace, which got the money. I'm curious why either Mr. Elizondo or whomever sat in his seat was not involved in that. But again, we can deal with that if you want to, Nick. I'm not trying to question anybody's integrity when it comes to Mr. Elizondo's claims, but I'm curious on what the discrepancy is here with these reports, the context that they were inserted into ATIP, who ultimately made the call. We know by Dr. Hal Puthoff it was him. And did the Pentagon even want these reports? The Drake equation report could absolutely be that if we achieve that warp drive, looking ahead for decades, it is possible they inserted that to have it and potentially, don't kill me for saying it, but to potentially pave the way for another contract if the DIA said, oh, yeah, let's pursue this, and they take another $22 million, give it to Bigelow Aerospace to then explore that. Because when government contracts are handed out, they don't just deliver the apple pie they were contracted to deliver. They'll give you the apple pie and show you another recipe on what they can bake in hopes that you might throw them another bone someday. And I think that is a big possibility. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. I mean, firstly, on the point, and I think, correct me if I'm misquoting it, but you mentioned, I think, with some of those contracts, the point about, yes, they have more conventional aerospace and aviation applications, which I absolutely don't deny. Now, I think when you are dealing with a program that touches this controversial subject, one thing that you always have to do is get we in the Ministry of Defence called it your stakeholder buy-in. First of all, you say, who are your stakeholders in government? Who has an interest in this? And to get that buy-in, and I don't just mean financial buy-in to get the thing funded, I mean the intellectual buy-in to have someone say in the first place, yes, we should be doing that. To get that buy-in, it's always useful if you do two things. Firstly, you say, yeah, there will be a lot of conventional aerospace spin-offs for us. And then that's the carrot. The stick, threats and opportunities again. The stick is, and if we don't do it, the Russians or the Chinese will do it first. And we don't want that, do we? And for that mindset, I think I would say to people, go back and look at Harry Reid's 2009 letter, where he ends up saying something like, this will help cement the U.S. position as dominant military force on this planet. Mm-hmm. So that's part of it. The second part is, now I'm at a disadvantage here. I am not intricately familiar with the U.S. contracts process when it comes to military. But what I can do is tell you how things worked in the UK, and I think it's a reasonable assumption that there's quite a lot of commonality. These things don't happen in a complete vacuum. There is, because of the well-known tendency for contractors to go off down rabbit holes and pursue passion projects, etc., etc. There is always a I don't know what they call them in the US, but basically a contracts liaison officer who will be attached to these programs. And so, yes, somebody like Hal Puthoff can say, I commissioned 38 papers to look into this. But as I say, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. And he may have authorized it, but you can be pretty sure, if the US system is anything like the UK system, that there will have been oversight as they went through the process. And that's to make sure that they deliver what the customer wants delivered. And so you would have had somebody in the Pentagon, maybe Luis Elizondo, maybe a liaison officer, whoever had that job would have been sitting alongside these people and saying, yes, that's what we want, or no, that's not what we want. Because what you don't want is to just leave somebody for 2-3 years and have them deliver something which is wide of the requirements. So if the US system is anything like the UK's, which I'm sure it was, this would not have been happening just in a vacuum, in isolation. Somebody at DIA, DOD would have been getting regular reports on what you're doing, what you're intending to look into, and they would be saying either, yes, that's absolutely what we want, or no, it isn't.
Yeah. And I'm eager to find out the answer to the question, just simply because we don't have the details yet. And it's, a slow trickle on exactly what the context is. Now, I don't want to keep beating the dead horse about the 38. We've obviously covered quite a bit and different angles, and appreciate that part of the conversation. We're kind of approaching here in the last 15 minutes the end of my time with you. So I wanted to deal with a couple other things, get your input on them. Obviously, in addition to these 38 reports, kind of backtracking a little bit, Mr. Luis Elizondo really spearheaded the release of 3 different videos. Therein lies another kind of controversy and discrepancy, but there were 3 videos released, most notably one from the USS Nimitz incident. What are your thoughts on these videos when you first saw them? Are they fascinating to you? Are they kind of interesting? What do you feel?
Well, it's a funny point, actually, in one sense that when the story first broke, it was almost at the heart of the story. In one sense, to me, it was almost the least interesting thing about the story, because we've seen these sorts of things before, of course. I mean, it's not the first time that military aircraft have chased UFOs. It's not the first time we've had gun camera footage, for example, of these things. So yeah, it was a fascinating part of the story, but I felt, looking at this, well, yes, I felt the media, in one sense, got so focused on, look at those nice, pretty pictures of these UFOs, that they didn't actually focus on arguably the bigger story. Hey, wait a minute, you said for years you didn't look at this, and now it seems that you did. Well, and there was staggeringly little, I guess, aggressive questioning of the official line on that. Now, that's where, of course, it got bogged down into the debate, which is where we started, about where is the line in this? Was it a far-term aerospace threat project? Was it a UFO project? Or was it a bit of both? Something which to get the Air Force buy-in promises all sorts of potentially useful spin-offs for aerospace, but is in fact a way of having a UFO program but embedding it in something else, making it more difficult to find, giving it a respectability, but nonetheless looking at UFOs amongst other things.
I was just a little let down when they did release the video that there's absolutely no context to it. I mean, we're told there are UFO videos that they investigated, but that aside, let's get to the controversy, because I'm curious to your thoughts on the fact that the Pentagon denied ever releasing the videos. Now, for the record, and I have said it on the program before, and I will say it again for the record, I don't believe the videos are fake. I never have. I've never said that. I did say with Linda Moulton Howe that if anything seemed fake to me, it was actually the audio, and I got a ton of heat for saying the fact that if something turns out to be fabricated, it was the pilot's voices being dropped in. I didn't make the claim. I said that was a possibility, and boy, did I get attacked for that. But that being said, I never said the videos are fake. I do believe they're real. But Nick, do you have any thoughts about the Pentagon really sternly saying on multiple fronts, to me included, we did not release those videos?
Yeah, and it's interesting that they said that as opposed to these videos are not genuine Pentagon videos. So it implicitly, admittedly, but it seemed to be, yes, these are real, but we didn't put them out there. This is just my personal pet theory on what happened. I may be wide of the mark, but again, with my background, this is kind of what popped into my head of the way that we would maybe do it. I suspect that they had this, they investigated, they looked at it within the intelligence community, they got all the usual imagery analysis resources and capabilities brought to bear on it, drew a blank. And then I suspect some kind of, maverick outside-the-box thinker thought, well, let's put them out there. Maybe take some of the information off, maybe change a few things just so that we can protect genuinely classified information, but put them out there, maybe on some specialist aviation forums. See if the deep specialists, many of whom are ex-military and intel community themselves, out there have got any ideas. Mm-hmm. So I suspect that it was a kind of quasi-official way of getting, leveraging, weaponizing the knowledge of the outside, people outside the intelligence community, in a way that would, maybe give them a degree of deniability. I may be completely wide of the mark there, but just with my own background, I thought I'd throw that out as my take on what I think might have happened.
No, I'm glad you did. I mean, this whole debate when it comes to the videos and releasing, because obviously I have spent the majority of my life now researching government secrets. I know the government is not truthful in many cases, that they cover things up. I think it's provable, documented, especially when it comes to UFOs. This whole debate about the videos and whether or not the DoD released it can be solved near immediately by where Mr. Luis Elizondo has claimed he has what is called a chain of evidence document to prove that the government, namely the DoD/the Pentagon, has released these videos, essentially insinuating that they are lying. He is very careful saying the lying word, but nonetheless, that's what he's implying. Yet he won't show the document. There's a select few people out there that say, I've seen it, but I can't, tell you about it, and hopefully they'll release it. I don't have a whole lot of respect for that, just simply because if he has it, it's not classified. I know that for a fact. If it is classified, he'd be in trouble. We all know that for a fact. That's how classification and security oaths work, especially when you retire. You can't just take classified stuff home with you as a souvenir. So there are two problems with this. Number one, he doesn't show it. Do you find anything weird about that, Nick?
I don't know the ins and outs of that story. I've only met Lou once. I've had a couple of phone conversations with him outside of that face-to-face meeting. I have not seen that document, and neither would I be able to really say much about it, because I'm familiar with the UK system of declassification and release, but I don't know the ins and outs of the US system, and I've seen some very, very complex discussions, some of which I know that you were involved with personally, about what the correct process would be. I think that sometimes, there are deep specialists in government on what the process should be, and sometimes, as we all know, even people in government don't know or do know but slightly are creative with the process. So I can't really speak to that. I think self-evidently the answer, if we are to get an answer on this, will come as it came 3 weeks ago or whenever it was with the release of this DIA letter. The answer to that sort of question will probably only come when the Pentagon decides that something is releasable. And I suspect that Lou is one of these people who I think for commendable reasons of loyalty and patriotism, doesn't want to be ahead of the curve and ahead of the wave when it comes to this. So, for example, in exactly the same way as I don't talk about British government documents until and unless the Ministry of Defence has released them. So I suspect, and I heard secondhand some feedback that said that presumably Lou and co. to the Stars Academy were pleased when I did publish this thing from the DIA's Office of Corporate Affairs, because that maybe loosened some constraints upon them. And I think, I know, you know better than me, there are upwards of, 3,500 ATIP requested Freedom of Information Acts in the system, and have been pretty much since the New York Times article came up. Some of them obviously are just, dear DOD, please send me everything you have on ATIP. But some of them, from people like you and Paul Dean, Roger Glassell, Keith Basterfield, are much more detailed and complex and carefully focused. Mm-hmm. Until and unless the DOD and DIA release further material on ATIP, I suspect that Lou is just going to be understandably cautious about this. I don't think he sees himself as a whistleblower. I think he sees himself as an expert commentator on something that the government has now itself acknowledged the existence of. But, yes, there is a line, and he's going to be darn careful not to cross it. Yeah,
I just wish you've kind of already answered the second part of my question, which was going to be asking you if you've ever seen on the American side, I know you said that you're more familiar with UK, a chain of custody document to prove declassification. In 2.1 million pages that I've received, I have never in a single instance on any topic in the entire history of the United States government, and I have records going back to World War I and before, seen a document like that I can say, oh, this is probably what he has. So I do hope one day he releases it, because I don't understand it. I can't figure out a good reason. There is zero reason that I can think of for him, because, and here's why I say that quickly, and I'm running out of time. What I'll say quickly is the fact that I know, and I've said it already, that the government is not truthful on many occasions. It's documented and provable. If he is advocating for a renewed interest in UFOs, whether it be by, congressional hearings, and then that turns into more projects like ATIP, I'm a supporter in what ATIP is rumored to be, being active and funded, right? So I want that for the record. I've always said that. I feel that it should be around. What I fear is that he is not releasing the documentation that he claims that he has to prove what he is saying and what a lot of us have been saying for many, many years. I don't know if he will, but I hope he does.
Well, I hope so too, but as I say, I suspect he will wait until there is an official release, so it may be that we need some of these other Freedom of Information Act requests to bear fruit before that other shoe will drop.
Yeah, I just go back to the fact that it wouldn't be classified if he has it. And so to prove my point, I literally just put this on this morning before our interview, unrelated to ATIP, unrelated to UFOs, but it was a declassified document that came from the National Security Agency. It is a component of it's under the DOD heading, just like the DIA, just like the Office of Secretary of Defense, etc. And when they release information like that for the first time ever outside the walls of the government, they put a routing and transmittal slip. That's not a chain of custody, but it has signatures on it, and it proves that the documents therein in that envelope are unclassified. Why do I bring that up? Because that is what the proof is when documents and videos and photographs are included in that. When documents are declassified, that's what you get. It's not chain of custody. But it's not like I can't get in trouble for putting that online.
No, I mean, self-evidently, again, the UK system, anything that is sent to a journalist or a researcher is by definition unclassified, right, because it has been declassified. It is either something that was never classified, or it's been declassified, or it's been redacted. So self-evidently, if you have something, usually in the UK, all you would get would be a cover note from the Public Affairs Office saying, here is what you've requested, or an almost identical cover note if you went down the Freedom of Information route. Here is the answer to your question. Now, sometimes there will be the additional safeguard that the agency themselves will publish it online in what we call a publication log, but essentially just, this is a list of what we have released under FOI, and here it is, and you can go back and check that it's genuine. And yeah, no one's sort of made up a request.
No, and to add to the confusion, and then I'm going to ask you one last question, and we'll talk about how people can order your newest book, and then I'll have to let you go. The one of the board members to the Stars Academy, on this note, on the videos and the declassification and the how they came out and so on, Dr. Gary Nolan. I've never spoken to Dr. Nolan. I am not trying to put any bad light on him, but I will say that he did release kind of a statement about how people were approaching this wrong. And he was saying that, and this is a quote, "The term release is where everyone is tripping up. These videos were obtained from a Freedom of Information Act filing." And then the quote goes on, but I'm running out of time. But that's the key. It was released through a FOIA. Now, that contradicted Mr. Luis Elizondo. But what I did was I went through the entire Freedom of Information Act case logs, which I think is what you were referring to about released information, but more so it lists everything that was requested. And I went through 2006, 2007 and beyond, and there was nothing in there to prove what he had said. And I think that those types of red flags that kind of add up are really what makes me scratch my head and ask questions. And what I will say in closing, before I ask you one last question, asking questions is not placing accusations. And I think that we all, as a UFO community in the hunt for the truth, we should be okay asking questions. And when we get a viable answer, great. Then we can move on to the next question. But until then, when there's this kind of shroud of secrecy in the private sector, from a corporation who claims to be a public benefit one, but they are kind of being just as secretive as the government, makes it really difficult to get down to the truth. That being said, one of my last questions to you, are you personally convinced ATIP is a UFO program?
I certainly think it may have looked at other things as well, which is why I say, it may be a hybrid. I have no doubt that it looked at UFOs, UAP, whatever acronym you want to use. It may have embedded that work in some more conventional, though still pretty exotic, aviation and aerospace programs. But essentially they, I am sure, looked at UFOs exactly as Elizondo and co. have said.
Well, very good. Nick, I'm glad you're on my team. I know we don't always agree with each other, but you are an amazing researcher and investigator and obviously a writer. Your newest book that you just published recently, Blood Brothers, is out. Give everybody a quick synopsis of Blood Brothers and how they can order it.
It is essentially an action thriller about terrorism, counterintelligence, etc. More to do with things that I did in my last MOD job than the one that I'm best known for. And Blood Brothers, you can order it actually on Amazon and Goodreads, of course, all those sites. But the best place, just go to my website, nickpope.net. Has information about my government work and also my books and links to where you can order them. But Blood Brothers is the latest one, and as I say, nothing to do with UFOs.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading it myself. It looks very, very cool. Again, www.nickpope.net. I will link all of the information on Nick and all of his books and how you can order on the show notes page. You can get that at www.theblackvault.com/show notes. Nick, I got to tell you this. It really was a pleasure to have you on the show. There, like I mentioned earlier, disagreements that we may have on the overall scope, but you are somebody I respect very, very highly in this field, not only because of your expertise, but obviously your friendship. You and I have known each other for many, many years, and I don't say that to many people in this field, but I do have a lot of respect for you. And if I could have this type of conversation, a friendly debate back and forth with anybody, you're definitely on the top of that list. So I want to thank you for taking so much time with me today.
Thank you. It was great to have a really deep dive into some of these fascinating questions.
Yeah, and the sad thing is I didn't even get to 50% of what I wanted to talk to you about. So we're going to have you on again, and hopefully we'll get some more of this out there and create some dialogue. That's what I think the general public needs. So thank you again for everything.
Thank you.
Although that concludes my interview with Mr. Nick Pope, don't go away. In a new segment on these special editions, I'll give some final thoughts for you to think about. Stay tuned. I decided to do something a little bit new on this special edition, just to give some final thoughts for you to think about. The reason I didn't put it in the normal interview is Nick is a very busy man, and he gave me an extended window to do his interview, so I didn't want to waste too much time blabbing myself. But there was a lot that Nick and I didn't get to cover. I had a long list of story points and bullet points. As you can tell, Nick and I really had an in-depth conversation of what ATIP was and possibly what it isn't. But there was a lot that we didn't deal with. There's also some things that I want for the record out there. If you have never heard me talk about ATIP, obviously I do get quite a bit of heat from some people out there. I don't really understand why asking questions is such a big deal to a select few, but it is a growing number of this small group of people that have decided that if I do anything related to the ATIP program that they find their ways to comment, ridicule, chastise, whatever you want to call it. I am not sure where that insecurity comes from, but I thought that I would explain a little bit of why this conversation is so important. Now, Nick and I touched a little bit about the name discrepancy. We didn't focus on it too much. I feel that that is not the most important red flag to focus on, although that is one that I get the most heat for. What I don't understand is some are questioning whether or not the name itself should even be a topic of debate. Now, why that is so important is that it does go to the core and the root and the heart of this story. That if the head of the program comes out and says the program name and the Pentagon comes out and says he's wrong, well, one side is not being truthful. That we can prove and that we know. The question is, why is one side not being truthful? Now, one could make a mistake. That's fine. But the discrepancy comes from the official spokesperson for the Pentagon. Now, literally, and this was just by chance, I have been trying, I mentioned it in the interview with Nick, to get the Defense Intelligence Agency's Public Affairs Office to confirm just the name. I do have some other questions for them, trying to get it addressed, but I just said, hey, if we can keep it simple, if you could just go ahead and confirm what Major Audricia Harris said to me, or do you dispute it? I have yet to get a response to that, although I did get one while I was recording with Nick. All it was the attachment of the DIA letter to Congress and the 38 reports that Nick and I talked about. No message attached. So, sadly, I don't have an actual answer still, because even though that letter does say Advanced Aerospace Threat and Identification Program, if you want to get down to brass tacks, that also contradicts what Mr. Luis Elizondo has said the name was. I know it's just a three-letter word called "and," but that is a discrepancy nonetheless. It echoes what the congressional record said, so it is quite possible that it is just human error. Whether it's aerospace or aviation, the insertion of that "and" could just simply be human error. When the DIA responded to Senator John McCain and Jack Reed, they could have just echoed what was in the original letter, which could have been just written by a staffer, not McCain himself. Now, obviously, the DIA, when they respond, are not going to just do it to a staffer, but we don't know the context of which John McCain, Jack Reed, or both had requested that information from the DIA. Hopefully, that will come out. I brought up context in the course of the interview because it is very important. Now, here is a very quick example of why context is important. Now, I saw a post, this is unrelated to ATIP, but I saw a post on Facebook about a declassified CIA document about the bloodline of the Illuminati. Now, that sounds pretty darn ridiculously cool if you ask me, and I thought, well, there's no way that that thing is real, because generally when you follow the links, they're clickbait articles. You go to, Bob's Spiritual Awareness News.org or, whatever it might be. And then there's really no credibility to what the story is. But they offered a CIA.gov link. And I thought, well, wait a minute, really? So I clicked on it, and it goes into the massive archive of what the CIA has on their website that you can download. Now, it is massive. There's millions of pages in there. If you know how to use it and know where to look and how to look, you can find quite a few different things. Sure enough, the document was real. Bloodlines of the Illuminati. Now, with a CIA official serial number, what they call a Maury ID number, so everything looked legit. And then obviously it was from the CIA.gov website. This is where I bring this up and why I say context is key. It took me about 5 seconds to realize that all that was a document within hundreds of thousands of pages, if not, I think, into the millions, and the terabytes of information that was confiscated from the compound of Osama bin Laden. After they raided the compound, they received hard drives and hard drives of material that they shipped back. The CIA has to, once they obtain that material, give it Maury ID numbers for reference, and it went into the massive collection from the compound of Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, or in Pakistan. Context is key. That was not a classified CIA document. It was not a CIA document at all. In fact, when you look at it, it was a PDF copy of a copyrighted book. Bin Laden just got his hands on it and put it onto his computer, and that's ultimately where it went into the CIA. Of course, if you don't research it, on the surface it looks pretty interesting, and this person, I'm not going to call him out, but it is probably a name that you would recognize, was touting this as proof that the CIA knew the bloodline of the Illuminati, and it was in classified records within CIA holdings. Well, that is actually all untrue. I had posted a comment on it, and of course, I was never responded to. Sometimes people don't like the truth. They don't like what the documents say. So instead of actually looking at the evidence or trying to digest the evidence, it's easier for some people to attack. Now, back to why I am bringing up the name. It does go to the core and honesty of the story, and the letter has yet another variation of the name. This is the letter that recently was released by the DIA. This was also the one that they just sent me, even though I'd already received it under the Freedom of Information Act, but there is no reference to whether or not that is the name or it is not. They just sent me that material, and that's it. So the name discrepancy still stands, and it does become very, very important on whether or not the DIA is lying, whether the Secretary of Defense office is lying, whether Mr. Luis Elizondo is lying. One of them is mistaken or maliciously lying. There's no way around it. I'm curious to know which side. But only one side is really withholding evidence that they claim that they have. That is a point that I've made on many occasions, and one that I will make again. Mr. Luis Elizondo, as I asked Nick Pope, said, I have chain of evidence custody to prove that the DOD released these videos and that they're real. Although I don't doubt they're real, I do doubt the context of which they were released. Mr. Elizondo is hiding that information. In the same breath that he's saying that the government is either ignoring or hiding information about UFOs, I'm not really sure exactly what he's going on the record saying, because I've heard slightly different variations of it. Regardless, what is it that he has that he feels that you and I can't see? It is public record. It would be if he has it. If it's classified, he's in violation of his security oath, and they would have went and got that document, whatever it is. I would contend that is not true. I would also contend that he is not going to violate his security oath and his security clearance. So whatever he has is not classified. There's no good reason not to release it, yet he hasn't. Moving on, what Nick and I had not talked about, or at least we didn't really focus on, is that credibility of Mr. Luis Elizondo. Now, Nick Pope obviously had made reference that he believes him, and that's fine. There is no reason that I can truly give to say, well, you can't believe him, and here's why. I just question it. In 22 plus years now of being in the UFO field and researching UFO documents, there is one thing that I have learned more than anything else, and that is trust no one. In the X-Files, the infamous line, trust no one, Mr. Mulder. Well, before I ever started researching, I heard that line, and it has stuck with me ever since. I don't trust anybody. Even though he comes from the government, and he probably is very patriotic, and he seems like somebody I'd throw back a couple beers with, and we'd have a great time just hanging out. Well, at least I think so anyway. It doesn't make everything that he says gospel. And so that's why I believe context is key, and why some of these questions absolutely need to be answered. Just as much evidence as we think that invisibility cloaking, warp drives, and wormholes plays a role in supporting Mr. Elizondo's story and a UFO research program, as I mentioned to Nick, it could absolutely play a role in supporting the United States government. Even though I love pointing out their discrepancies and all of the lies that they have given me over the years and that are provable and documented, I do believe that the same way that you would answer that this supports Mr. Elizondo, I would argue and contest it could actually be supportive of the government as well. The Drake equation and wormholes, all of that is fascinating, but as I pointed out earlier, and I kind of want to drill the point again, all of that can be inserted from the private sector. Even though there could, and we hope that there's government oversight, we don't know that for sure. Nick testified or gave his information about what the UK's side of this would be. Sadly, the United States does not operate in the same exact way. I'm not saying Nick is wrong. I'm just saying is we don't know yet. All we have is Dr. Hal Puthoff himself saying, I made the decision. Was there government oversight? Possibly. Was it Mr. Elizondo or whoever sat in the seat before he did? Quite possibly. Did they instruct Dr. Puthoff to get information on the Drake equation because they want to see if UFOs are connected to aliens? Quite possibly. The bottom line is, though, we just don't know. It's premature to think that the Pentagon said, we want Drake equation information, wormholes, because we think some of the craft that we're seeing could be extraterrestrial. So Dr. Puthoff, make it all happen. Although that's a possibility, it's fairly unlikely. Because when you talk about stuff that would be that earth-shattering on multiple levels, and that is a different show in itself, but the existence of aliens admitted or evidence thereof that's irrefutable, in my opinion, would be a very classified topic. In my opinion, it would never go outside of the United States government in the private sector. It would never generate 38, mostly, with the exception of one, unclassified reports. Unclassified. That's key. Nick and I didn't talk about that. I was curious to what he said. Now, we do know that the UFO programs like Project Blue Book, and Nick said the UK version was largely unclassified in the sense that it was public knowledge. I just don't buy the fact that this one, if it had anything to do with UFOs and really got into alien life and possibly a connection between the two, would generate 37 unclassified reports, one of which is classified, but primarily just because of the information therein, and it kind of makes sense. The 38th on the list, or I think it's 37 on the list, which holds the same title as number 38. That's also confusing. State-of-the-art and evolution of high-energy laser weapons. Well, of course, something like that would be classified. 37 and number 38 hold the same exact title with the same author, by the same company, Directed Technologies. One, number 37, is classified secret. Number 38 is unclassified. What's the difference between the two? Well, we don't know yet. I do have multiple FOIA requests open and have for quite some time. Here's the kicker that I've never said yet. This is partially because I want to see if you guys are paying attention and actually listening. I've never said this publicly, but by chance, by a pure stroke of luck, a couple years ago, in fact, a couple years prior to ATIP ever being announced publicly, I, on accident, or call it a stroke of luck, had requested DIA records made under the Defense Warning Office, or the DWO. Now, why is that important? Because all of the DIRDs that have been released thus far have made reference to the Defense Warning Office being part of the DIA, and it was prepared under that office, among other divisions as well. But the DWO was mentioned there. Why is that important? Because years prior to the ATIP story breaking, I requested every single DWO report ever generated. The way I worded the request, it would actually include 100% of all records made under ATIP. Now, I am prepared with a response, which I won't go into detail for obvious reasons. I am prepared when the DIA says, hey, your request is too voluminous, meaning there is too much responsive material. I know what I'm going to say immediately in response to get it to a point that they can process it and hopefully release these records. Now, of course, I have another request that specifically requests these. But why I bring it up is the fact that that FOIA request now has a couple-year head start on all of the other ones that were flooding into the DIA. I'm not sure where the figure came from of 3,500 plus that Nick had stated. I'm not challenging that. I just don't know where it came from. But let's say that that's true. Thousands of requests poured in for these documents. Thankfully, mine has a couple-year head start in the queue. And that has been the biggest drawback to the fact that the Defense Intelligence Agency was involved in this, and that is that they are so backlogged with their Freedom of Information Act requests. I'm going to defend them, not a cover-up. It's just simply they are slammed with Freedom of Information Act requests. So I'm hoping this year will bring a response to that request I filed years ago that was, again, a stroke of absolute luck. In the end, though, we don't have answers, at least nothing concrete. One thing that I do as a researcher and an investigator is I put all the pieces together like a puzzle. And I will liken this to doing a 30-piece puzzle with my near 5-year-old son. We love putting them together, and I love seeing him take pieces of the puzzle and put them together like a picture. What I do with government documents is just that. Those 30 pieces of his puzzle represent documents that I've received under the Freedom of Information Act. That's what I try and do, is put them together like a puzzle. Here's why I compare it to a 5-year-old's puzzle. For me to operate as an investigator and to deliver information to you, I need to have enough pieces of the puzzle that if you take one piece out, you still know it's a picture of a dinosaur. That the evidence is overwhelming enough to show you enough of the picture that you can say, Daddy, this is a picture of a dinosaur. You might be missing a piece or two or even 3, but that leaves you with 27 pieces of that dinosaur puzzle that allows you to put it together. Now, obviously, I am simplifying this a lot, but my point is that if you only have 2 pieces of a puzzle and you take one out, you don't know what you're building. You don't know what you're putting together. Mr. Elizondo might be the most honest person on this planet, but he won't talk to me or people like me that want to ask these questions. Here's another one that I wanted to ask Nick that I'll pose to you. If you're at a conference where he is appearing at, ask him this question. ATIP was a Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA, program. How could he head it from the Office of Secretary of Defense, which is where we know he worked? How do we know that? He said that to me directly through his PR agent at To the Stars Academy. That was before I was blacklisted. That answer may be completely acceptable and simplistic, could have a very straight answer. Yet that plays a role in why I ask and question a bit of his credibility and his story. The ATIP program was at an agency he did not work at. Could he play a role in it? Could he be a voice in it? Could he have somehow been involved? Of course. That's not far-fetched. What's far-fetched is to believe that he was the desk in Rome that all roads led to. That is how he put it in one of the interviews that he gave. So when you make a statement like that, you shouldn't have a desk at the Office of Secretary of Defense. You should have one at the DIA. And yet he didn't. What also throws a monkey wrench into the wheel is the testimony of Dr. Hal Puthoff. He said in front of a big crowd in Las Vegas, he was the one that made all of the decisions on the 38 reports. Was there oversight? We don't know. We hope so, but here in America, absolutely nothing goes smoothly, properly, or by the book. How do I know that? Just look at the millions of government documents that you can find on theblackvault.com to prove that very point. So hopefully there was oversight. Hopefully we will learn that ATIP was a UFO program, and hopefully we'll take the next step in trying to figure out the context of those videos released. Until then, it's just premature to start going down to our knees and saying, this is it. This is gospel. This is proof of a government cover-up, and they're hiding evidence of aliens. I just don't buy it. One last point that I'll leave you with is those 38 reports that Nick and I talked extensively about. I did bring up the fact that I published, and you can download them on the Black Vault, information and reports and research on metamaterials, which has become a buzzword now when they talk about UFOs, due to Mr. Luis Elizondo and this program. But I've published quite a few reports on metamaterials and their connection to invisibility cloaking. My whole point with this is then, in addition to that, I have not published these yet, simply because the amount of information that I have found on metamaterials itself. Those 38 reports are fascinating when you stand alone, when they stand alone and you say, hey, that's why this is a UFO research program. Look at what they're doing. But when you broaden the horizon and research a little bit, remember those bloodlines of the Illuminati? When you broaden your scope a bit and look at what's really out there and what it all means, you realize that invisibility cloaking, warp drives, even the Drake equation, all the way down to wormholes and beyond, have been research angles of Air Force Research Laboratory contracts, of Air Force contracts, Army Research Offices contracts. All of that is documented in the documents that I put out there. And there is so much on metamaterials, I don't even have the time to build the archive. That's how much is there, not related to ATIP. So remember, context is key, and that's what this is all about. Never be afraid to ask a question. As I told Nick, asking a question is never placing an accusation. It's just trying to get clarity. But when people refuse to answer the questions, that makes me ask a few more and question the story in itself. My name is John Greenewald Jr., and you've been listening to the Black Vault Radio. If you found this worthwhile, I hope you do subscribe. Do so at www.theblackvault.com/show notes. This is episode number 23, and you'll also find all of the subscribe buttons on that page. This is John Greenewald Jr. signing off. We'll see you next time.